Should the Constitutional Democratic Party be a center-left party that can work together with other parties on its side of the aisle to present a viable alternative to the conservative ruling bloc? Or should it be a centrist party that will shed its leftist elements to be taken seriously? In this two-part series, we will look at the tightrope that Yukio Edano and his party is treading to make use of the opposition's biggest shot at taking the majority in the lower house in close to a decade. Japan is expected to hold its next election for the House of Representatives on October 31st, and it'll be the first ordinary national election since the start of the COVID crisis and the resignation of former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the longest-serving leader of Japan. The ruling LDP has been catching flack over a myriad of scandals, such as a case involving vote-buying bribes, and the administration of former Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga has especially come under fire for its lackluster handling of the COVID pandemic. This has placed the opposition parties in their best positions to win seats in the lower house since the now-defunct Democratic Party of Japan was last in power through 2012. In an NHK poll taken earlier this month, 28% of respondents said that they wish to see the opposition gain seats, slightly beating out 25% seeking an increase for the ruling bloc. Leading the charge is the CDP, which is the largest opposition party in Japan, with 112 seats in the lower house, including independents caucusing with it. Leader Yukio Edano has prior experience in government, having served as the chief cabinet secretary under former Prime Minister Naoto Kan during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant meltdown. Other opposition parties in the House of Representatives include the left-wing Japanese Communist Party, which has long abandoned its revolutionary goals and is more of a social liberal party now, and the Democratic Party for the People, a centrist party with strong backing from labor unions. There is also the Nippon Ishin no Kai, which is aiming to become a third force in parliament, but we'll put him aside for now. The NHK poll taken last month put the CDP's support rate at a dismal 6.1% compared to the LDP's 41.2%. The JCP and DPP are at 2.7% and 0.7% respectively. The numbers don't directly translate into ballots though, as many of the 36.1% who did not back any party in the poll will end up voting for the opposition to balance out the gap in support. The CDP's path to victory depends heavily on building coalitions. The relatively new party does not have the organized support to take power by itself, especially with the opposition being fragmented for so long. The tough question is, with whom it should strengthen ties. One option is to work together with this JCP. This would take the form of unifying behind one candidate per electoral district to boost the chances of victory. To understand this, let's first look at how lower house members are elected in Japan. The House of Representative election uses a parallel voting system in which voters select a candidate from their local districts in a first-past-the-post system, and then select a party for the party list proportional representation system. The JCP has a long tradition of fielding candidates in as many electoral districts as it can, despite the fact that it has virtually no chance in winning any of them. Although only a handful of candidates have ever been elected from the first-past-the-post system, the JCP's presence in campaigns lead to higher turnout among its base, and therefore more votes for the party in the proportional representation part of the election. In many electoral districts, votes against the LDP candidate outnumbers votes for, but LDP members win anyway because the opposition votes are split between the JCP and the CDP or other opposition parties. By coalescing behind one candidate, the opposition can theoretically expect to kick out the incumbents in many regions. The JCP has been calling on the main opposition party to streamline their candidates in what has been characterized as Yato Kyoto, or a united opposition front. And to this end, the CDP and JCP agreed on a plan to form a confidence and supply relationship, with the CDP taking the government if they can gain enough seats. But the option isn't without internal pushback within the party. Although the two parties' support bases may be similar, there is no guarantee that choosing one party's member as the unified candidate will lead to backers of the other party all voting for that candidate. This is especially true of the centrist voters, who may think that working together with the JCP is too far left and vote for the LDP instead. And on a more local level, some CDP and JCP members aren't too fond of each other. Especially in JCP strongholds like Kyoto, the CDP and its predecessor, the Democratic Party of Japan, have long fought against the communists, making them bitter enemies. Such anti-communists are not uncommon because the CDP has increased its size by pitching itself as an anti-LDP big tent party for conservatives and liberals alike. There are some policy differences too, especially over what to do with consumption tax, but the differences are very slim and not significant enough to warrant concern about a possible alliance. But more importantly, cozying up to the JCP is strongly opposed by the CDP's biggest organized supporter, Rengo, of the Japanese Trade Union Confederation. Rengo is Japan's biggest labor union national center, with about 7 million members. Rengo is made up of many smaller groupings of labor unions, divided by industry, and many of their biggest unions represent full-time regular workers at major corporations. Rengo has backed the opposition since the days of the DPJ, and several opposition lawmakers are former members of the Rengo-affiliated unions. Rengo formally backs both the CDP and the DPP, which is to the right of the CDP. Rengo is not the only national center for labor unions in Japan, although it is by far the largest. There is also Zenroren, which we'll talk about later. The CDP's strategy of working with the Rengo is clear. Listen to what Rengo wants so that its members and labor unions across Japan will vote for the party. This has made opposition candidates especially strong in certain areas with a large labor population, such as some districts in Aichi Prefecture, home to automakers such as Toyota, and Ibaraki Prefecture, home to Hitachi. So why is Rengo against the CDP's cooperation with the communists? Firstly, there are differences in their policy goals. Rengo rejects some of the left-wing policies adopted by the CDP, and is looking to back a political force it describes as kaikaku-chudo, or reformer-centrist. For example, Rengo is especially against efforts by the CDP and JCP to abolish nuclear power plants. A part of this has to do with the fact that unions of power utilities and equipment makers hold considerable sway in Rengo, and they benefit from the operation of nuclear power plants. But the animosity towards the JCP runs deeper than that. In fact, it's rooted in the history of Japan's labor movement. Japan initially had several national centers for labor unions, such as Sohyo, which was mostly made up of unions in the public sector, such as teachers' unions, and Dome, made up of mainly private sector unions. Sohyo was the more progressive of the two, took a generally oppositional stance against corporate management, and backed the now-defunct Japanese Socialist Party, while Dome was more moderate, sought a conciliatory approach against corporations, and backed the Democratic Socialist Party, which was to the right of the JSP. There was also the Toitsu Rosokon, made up of unions that generally backed the communists. The groups jockeyed for power in the field of labor politics, and power meant the ability to represent labor in Japan and influence over what labor policies were adopted by the government. In 1987, Sohyo and Dome, along with other smaller union groups, merged to form Rengo. The merger was done for several reasons, one being the weakening of labor movements in Japan due to the declining membership. Another was to consolidate power so that labor unions backing the communists will be weakened in the world of labor politics. However, some of the unions in Sohyo criticized the formation of Rengo as a rightward turn for Japan's labor movement and joined Toitsu Rosokon member unions to form Zenroren in 1989. So we see from the history of Rengo's formation that the JCP and unions backing it are enemies in the field of labor politics. Allowing the CDP to cooperate with its political rivals is too much to ask from Rengo, whose standing as Japan's leading labor representative depends on its ability to remain stronger than Zenroren. Tomoko Yoshino, who recently became Rengo's first female leader, said that the National Center rejects CDP's plan to form a confidence and supply relationship. In her first press conference, Yoshino complained that the JCP was using its cooperation with the CDP to exert influence on the campaigns of Rengo-backed candidates. So which side should the CDP lean towards at the moment, and why? Will that choice pay off in the upcoming general election? Stay tuned for part 2 of this series.